Hello again, and welcome to another episode of SNJ in Conversation with me, Tania and my SNJ partner, Renata Blower. I do hope you're enjoying the series so far, and today we're pleased to have with us a giant of the SEND world, Dame Christine Lenehan. Dame Christine was awarded her damehood in 2016 for outstanding services to disabled children. She's been a leading force behind the Council for Disabled Children, where she's director for almost 20 years, conducting numerous reviews for government departments. Christine has been a stalwart defender for the rights of children and young people since she began her career as a social worker almost 40 years ago. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Tania. Thank you, Renata. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Just to say, we've sourced our questions from our readers and we've streamlined them for time. And if there's one person who's seen it all in SEND, Christine, it's you. What do you see as the root cause of the difficulties faced by families trying to get support from education and social care services? So not an easy one to start with, but right in there. What's your view?
I think social care is probably the hardest bit of that. I think education at least is a universal service. People might struggle to get it and might understand it, but it is a universal service. I think the challenge of social care is twofold. One, that it's targeted, so it will only ever provide services to a small amount of people, a small amount of time. But the second thing is that actually social work with disabled children is a completely different task than social work with vulnerable children. And actually, the vast majority of parents of disabled children would never access social care or social work if the system was not designed to make it the gateway to access. So if you have a disabled child and you want your child to go to the Brownies, to join a Saturday afternoon adventure, you need a bit of direct payments, you need a bit of support. The system as it's currently constructed forces you through a statutory system, and that statutory system is not particularly well equipped to deal with the challenges and to deal with the particular knowledge and expertise. I qualified actually 40 years ago this month as a social worker. Thank you. I've worked with disabled children and their families all of that time, and I've never wanted to do anything else. But throughout that time, I've often worked in a system where people struggle to value the work we do with disabled children and their families, and run on some concepts which are unhelpful. So my belief is, if I'm working with a family, I work alongside them, and that my job is not to make that family dependent on me. It's to say to that family, what is it you need to live the life that you and your family want to live and are able to live? And what is the minimum amount of state intervention that works in order for you to be in control? And I think part of that is, I was once doing a report on something or other, as you suggested, and I was sat listening to a group of parents, and one of the parents said, the system takes my child. They take them and they pull them into parts, and then I have to put them back together again. And it really struck in my head, and has done ever since. The system shouldn't be about taking your child apart. It should be about working with you in partnership to build resilience and support. And I think there are still some fundamental challenges. I'm hoping that when the government announces the care review, which is coming up soonish, that actually we can actually go back to fundamentals on some of this.
Thank you. Another difficult question, I suspect, is social care and education decision-making panels are currently held without any parental representation, and also there's no transparency as to what's actually discussed at these meetings. What's your view on this?
I think it's really interesting. I am totally into fairness and transparency. What I've been saying to people for a long time is, when you're doing an assessment with a family, you need to be asking three questions. You need to be asking a question of what the purpose of the assessment is, because families are assessed and assessed and assessed and assessed. You need to be asking, what's the likely outcome of this going to be? You know, why are we doing it? And you need to ask yourselves, how is it building on all the other assessments this family's had? So when we're looking at panel assessments or anything else, I expect families to be really clear about process and about what might happen and how those decisions are made and what the outcomes are. Should families be there? Well, I've experienced two lots of things, I suppose. When I worked in fostering for disabled children, we had foster parents at panel, and sometimes that was easy and sometimes it wasn't. I've worked in situations where we've had representative parents on panels, and I think that's been really difficult for everyone. The parents have been considered to understand all the needs of all parents, and I'm not convinced that's a burden that parents should play, and I felt uncomfortable in that. And the system processes are often not built in a way that enables full participation. So for me, we should keep trying different ways of working out, but the big thing for me is families should be really clear when anything's going to any panel, what evidence is going, what the outcomes are being discussed, when they're going to know about it, and if they don't like that decision, what their right of appeal or next stage concern is going to be.
Can I just ask what your thoughts are then on perhaps parents having meeting notes so they are completely aware of what was discussed in the meeting?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. I mean, I think the only thing you ever get to, I think, again, we go back to what the concept for particularly social care is, but education in a way. What I need to be aware of all the time as a social worker is the vast majority of the families I work with, I should be totally open, totally transparent and work in partnership. There will be a very small number of families of disabled children, as there are within the general population, where there will be safeguarding issues and where that transparency is still important but becomes more difficult. So I'm quite happy with meeting notes to discuss that, because it should say about resources, provision, eligibility, thresholds, all of those things, provided in sharing those notes we don't make children or families more vulnerable. That would be my only caveat.
Right.
It's still very hard to get a social care assessment, for example, as part of the EHCP process. I mean, quite often they will just say, you know, not known to service, and that's it. So what needs to happen to better integrate that? How can we change this paradigm within social care that, you know, they kind of think the Children and Families Act, when it comes to EHCPs, don't apply when they clearly do?
I think it goes back to the fundamentals about how needs of families are looked at. So we've been working on this in the Council for Disabled Children since the 2014 Act came in, producing endless screeds of guidance for social care. And I suppose a number of things. One, I think there's a really big turnover in social care workers. And, you know, you think when you're running a training programme with professional staff, you can do level 1 and then level 2 and then level 3. And actually what we found is almost every single time we're going back to the beginning, back to the beginning, back to the beginning. The legal framework for how social care and social work is delivered for disabled children is complex. And you're always trying to get people to understand that. About 4 years ago, maybe now, the Law Commission actually wanted to look at the legal framework for disabled children, and we supported them in that. It didn't in the end get off the ground, but it does give us a challenge. I think the third thing is people confuse social care and social work. Very, very few families of disabled children have social workers. About 8 or 9%. The vast majority of parents do not need a social worker because they're totally capable of getting on with their lives and doing the things they need to do, but they need access to appropriate social care when that happens. And it's why one of the things that I want to come out of the SEND review, when that also relaunches shortly, is a real look again at the local offer. So the local offer was meant to be the solid information and advice and support service for families that replaced those at the school gate conversations that many families of disabled children don't have. So in terms of social care, it should have been able to tell you where your child's activities could happen, what was going to happen in the summer holidays, whether there were friendship and support groups, where your local parents' forums were. It should have provided that bedrock, and then it should have had a link in it that said, and if you need more than this, these are the ways in. And I don't think, in some places, I think we can see elements of that. In other places, as you know from the inspection reports, we are not really seeing an effective local offer. So I think underpinning social care is a really good local offer that we build on.
Because, of course, you know, families don't know what they don't know. So they don't know what their child might be eligible for without a social care assessment as part of an EHCP. And they don't know even what's out there. So it's really crucial that this aspect, this element of the EHCP needs assessment is put right.
It is. That early information, again, I think for all the years I've worked with families, one of the things that's really struck me about listening to family stories is how isolated families feel, particularly in those early days when they think that what has happened, and it has only happened to them because it's their unique set of circumstance, but how you then provide support. And I think one of the things that frustrated me when I was a social worker is, for example, working with very low income families, I'd come across a family with an 8-year-old who should have been getting family fund money for the last 6 years, but no one professional had bothered to tell them that. So that sort of real earliness about support for families is key. And one of the things we used to run some years ago was the early support programme, and I still think fundamentally our early support's not good enough. You should not need to use statutory services to find basic entitlement. You should be able to get that. But you're right that every time we take a step forward, somehow or other, the way that we structure things means that they don't sustain. So almost every new shiny idea is just a reinvention of the ideas that have gone before. And now is the time to try and hold that. And maybe that makes me sound slightly weary after 40 years of doing it. But I think what keeps me going is the stories of those new families, which, as you lot are all very well aware, is often the stories of the families that I had met in my early days, really.
Absolutely. As you know, the SNJ tribunal trial has just been extended by another year. These trial cases are often longer as they're more complicated, and at the moment local authorities are getting extra costs to cover it, but obviously parents get no costs covered. What do you think about how this might unfairly skew the trial results and also further exclude less well-off families?
I really worry about tribunals, and I worry about them because I think that every tribunal is a failure. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think that the amount of energy, the amount of money, the amount of personal and emotional investment that people go through is just so often out of proportion to what a good solution would have looked like for the child. So I'm really concerned about where the tribunals are going, and I have endless conversations about the system, which is that theoretically, as you know, access to the tribunal is free. You don't need legal representation. But often families do not feel that that is going to get their case heard or they're going to be supported in that. And anything to do with the legal system is quite frightening if you don't know it. And what has happened, I think, is families have representation, therefore local authorities have representation, and we get involved in a bidding war. And I think what that means is that families with less resource, whether that's a financial resource or an emotional resource, struggle to go through that journey. And I think that's absolutely right. So the trials continue. I think that's right. One of the reasons we backed the trial was when the Children and Families Act came in, the Education, Health and Care Plan was meant to be a single assessment holding all three agencies to account. And yet we had no system behind it that enabled that to happen. So the tribunal trial was about saying, can we have a single system that holds all three agencies to account? And one of the things I'm really, really keen on seeing is a piece of work that I'm currently badgering people on. which is to understand in far more detail what's happening in tribunal. I almost want to write something which is called How Never to Get to a Tribunal, which is about local authorities understanding the things where they're always going to be get picked up because, quite frankly, they're not following the law, and parents to understand actually what expectations are and what's clear and when you ask for what and how you get support and what you do. Because I'm worried, in a sense, that the money and the energy that families and authorities expend in legal action detracts them from actually providing a really good service.
I think LA seem to just kick it down the road and, you know, cross their fingers. But at least if they lose, they've saved, you know, those months of money, but without thinking about the cost to the child and to the family. And that is morally wrong.
I agree that it's when you talk to social workers or other professionals about why families of disabled children can come across as so angry, what you have to say to them, and I'm really clear about this, is it's not the child's impairment that makes families angry. It's the way the system reacts to the child's impairment that makes the system that makes families angry. So actually, why are families angry? And the answer is because we make them that way. And that, I think, is sinful, to be honest.
I think you're absolutely right that there's a huge emotional cost. I think there's also a financial cost for some parents who can pay, but there's also a time cost. And I've been to tribunal, and I worked out it probably cost me about 100 hours worth of my time. And I've got 3 children, all with lots of needs. And when you consider actually where are you going to be taking that time from, it's taking time away from the kids. So it's always the children that end up being penalised as a result.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I get back, and rightly so, is actually what we want parents of disabled children to be is parents. We don't need them to be litigators. We don't need them to be care coordinators. We need them to be parents. I would far rather you had spent that time playing with your children, supporting their learning, having a good time.
And also there's an imbalance as well around parents who are capable of fighting. So not just emotionally, but, you know, I'm lucky, I'm very well educated, and so I could sit down and I could learn the law. I hated doing it, but I had to do it. Whereas not all parents, you know, can do that, and not all parents can access support either in order to help them. It's a really, really unfair system, I think, at the moment.
And there's a racial and economic disparity as well. Totally.
And I think that's interesting, though, isn't it? Because how do we how do we design a system where actually what's there is fair for all? Because also, and I know it's interesting, and I think it's unpopular, I think what we should have is a state contract, almost a set of expectations that parents are really clear about from the state in terms of what they should have to support their child. And for some families that might not cover all their needs, but it is what the state can offer that is fair. And then if you choose to have more than that, you can have more than that. But I do worry that in a litigious system, and a system, as you say, Tania, that has those racial and economic disparities in it, we end up with an unfair system. But that's a really mature conversation with families and a really mature conversation with professionals. And I'm not sure we're there yet. But I'm keen on understanding it and having it. What would good look like? Not what perfect would look like, what wonderful would look like, but what does good look like, and how do we support that? Because you can see the disparities all over the place.
One of the things that Tania and I have discussed is perhaps having a professional code of conduct for those within the SEN system. So actually the professionals that are working with families are signed up to a code of conduct of what the expectations are for their behaviour, and so that can be referred back to. And then there's some kind of moral and ethical code within the SEN community, sort of the professional community, that perhaps isn't there at the moment.
I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, it's interesting. When people ask me what works, you know, where do you see good services, what works, wherever, and really the answer is where you see the best is where confident parents who understand their rights, who understand what they can ask for, are working with confident professionals. Those professionals need to have a code of conduct, you're right, but as part of that they also need to be able to say to parents, this is what I can offer. This is what I can do no more, but this is what I can offer. This is how it fits your rights. These might be where the shortfalls are, but the shortfalls are about how this country decides to prioritise disabled children, how much money it spends on them.
But there has to be room within that for creativity, I think. Anything that's too set in stone stops professionals, being creative and coming up with solutions and actually tailoring things so they are about the child and not one standard size fits all. It's really important that actually they're looking at the child. Everything always goes back to the child, doesn't it?
Absolutely, totally. I think one of the big things that's come out for me, I've been looking at all the evidence on the pandemic, where things have worked for families, where they haven't worked for families. And there are some fairly awful stories that have come out over the last 3 months. But one of the things where things work is that personalised element, where families were put in control, where they had access to direct payments, where they had access to flexible funds, where they had access to making the key decisions that they knew would work for them. Now, personalisation is one of those things that's gone in and out of government policy. But I am really keen that as part of the learning from the pandemic, personalisation becomes one of the threads for the SEND review. How do you work in a way that's creative to family need within a system that supports that and enables that to happen? And
that's a whole culture shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which was supposed to happen with the 2014 reforms, that it shifts from system-based to, child-based, and it hasn't happened. So, in your experience, how do you think that you can change that and shift that balance towards what the individual child needs?
I suppose part of it, as you both know, is I'm a terrier with a bone. I don't let things go. That's not my style. And I just think that things go in phases, don't they? A while ago, 8-9 years ago, we had a big thing on direct payments in social care. That was the way things were going to go, all of that. We actually don't even have any legal guidance for that now because the 2014 Act superseded it. So I just think there are ways of holding on to the wind. There are ways of coming back and saying to government, if you want the SEND reform to do two things, you want it to be radical, which is great. You want it to be sustainable. That's good too. Then actually you have to look at what the solutions are that are staring you in the face. And those solutions are about personalisation. Those solutions are about moving a mind shift. They're about moving a mind shift that says the vast, vast, vast majority of parents of disabled children are sensible, clear advocates for their child, and we need to work with them now. And actually work with them to get what we want at the lowest level. So the challenge is that a lot of parents of disabled children terrify the life out of local authority officials and health officials and anybody else that they come back to. So part of the change is being clear from a parental point of view what matters, but also using the system guidance and approach to support professionals to be confident in their dealing with families.
Because what's happening though is in many cases is the complete opposite of that. When the parent is thought of as difficult, and they force the LA to tribunal, then they do find that they're being subjected to Section 47 proceedings. What do you make of that?
Oh, I'm interested in that, Tania, because I haven't heard that yet. I haven't seen that yet. I mean, we are, obviously, one of our interests is safeguarding for disabled children, and I am a strong proponent of child-centred decisions, and I don't think our safeguarding processes are good enough. And in some cases, if that means taking parents on, then I'm happy to do it. On the other hand, the vast, vast majority of our parents are able, strong advocates of children. If you are, through your membership, seeing any correlation between that, then I would really, really want to see the evidence. And I would be very clear about wanting to look at that and understand that further. One of the other things we've been doing is the guidance, statutory guidance on safeguarding disabled children is now out of date, like lots of things. And we are pushing government on actually saying, you know, this is critical guidance, let's have it up to date.
We've also noticed that the safeguarding guidance for all children has got a lot softer, so softer signs of abuse. And a lot of those correlate exactly with the sort of signs you'd see with a child with an undiagnosed condition, which has been quite an issue for us, because then, of course, children or families are being put under suspicion rather than actually the child getting the help that they need. And we think that this kind of softening down of the guidelines has caused issues all around.
And conditions like Ehlers-Danlos as well that can cause easy bruising.
Yeah. One of the long-term systemic challenges is the division between disabled children's teams and child protection teams, and it's almost like they exist on different planets, and they've got very different cultures, and I think that's a real challenge. And I think in working with any child where there are concerns, your first job as a social worker, as a professional at any level, is to understand what's going on, is to understand context. So it's not to jump to conclusion, it's not to jump in, it's to say, what is it we know about this and how do we understand this and whatever. And I suppose it goes back to where you started, Tania and Renata, which is what that relies on is really good interagency working. It relies on being part of a team where I can say to a doctor or an educator or a psychologist or a therapist, I've noticed this, should I be worried? Is there any other cause? Can we do? There will be mistakes in the system, there always are, but the issue is starting with the right viewpoint, isn't it?
That also comes down to training, so they can recognise disabilities in children, understand, you know, how they might affect the child and the family. Can you tell me a bit about how social workers for disabled children are trained differently to social workers for children who are at risk?
So all social workers should have a baseline that's the same. They should understand the law. They should understand how to work with families. They should understand child development. They should understand the system in which they operate. And they should understand diversity within that system. How do you work with different families from different backgrounds in different ways? And then you're right, they should understand different children. One of the things we've been trying to do for a while, and we haven't succeeded yet, is to work with the College of Social Work and build a knowledge and experience base for social workers of disabled children. I don't think, I've been a social worker for about 5 or 6 years or something, and I was working with a particular family in a particular difficult set of circumstances, and my local authority bosses said to me, "You're quite good at this, Christine. Why do you waste your time on disabled children? You could be a proper social worker with adolescents." And that stuck in my brain. It didn't make me change direction, but I don't think as well there is a recognition that actually good social work with disabled children is actually a really skillful task, because it is about understanding children. It's more than learning Makaton and understanding PEC symbols. Don't get me wrong, the communication with children themselves is really important, but it is actually understanding what the context of having a disabled child does to a family, and then actually working with that family along the way. So I think one of my favourite frustrations is actually listening to professionals from across the pieces who say, well, you know, we did tell them, Christine, we gave them a leaflet. So that real lack of understanding that families have to be at a point where they want to receive information before that they can process they've received it. And I don't think our training is good enough. And again, what I want to look at is knowledge and experience statements. If we start off, and again, maybe we can push the care review. If we start off by believing that social work for disabled children is a skillful task, and that actually, as part of training, whether it's part of initial training or part of COP, continuous professional development or whatever, that actually any social worker wanting to work with families with disabled children should have a baseline. And that goes back to your values and your professional code, but it also goes back to some of the worst social workers of families of disabled children work to tragedy model. They work with families and they never see the child. They get lost in the grief and challenge that often parents face. They don't see the child. They get lost in the whirlwind. They're not able to stand back enough and say to a family, what is it you need? How is your child being supported? What can I offer? How do we go forward? So I think there is a real training and skills development issue. And at CDC, under our government contracts, we do a tiny, tiny part of that. But I would really want to see it embedded, because good social work practice for disabled children is about working alongside families and children and supporting them to make the best decisions about the lives of their children.
And also, I would have thought that the role differs quite a lot between the two types of social worker. I mean, it shows a misconception I had, because I believed that a social worker working with disabled children, that was a further training. So you'd be trained as a social worker and then you went on to have further training because it was a more advanced role. So it shows that a misconception of mine, that I actually thought that social workers would be properly trained once they, in order to be able to take on that role. So do you think that's something that perhaps should happen, that it should be a clear professional development pathway for social workers to go on?
I really, really like your misconception, Renata. I think it's great. And yeah, I think it should be. I think we should recognise it as valuable and skillful. So what happens is social workers get trained to a base level to practice. They then go in. The vast majority of social workers go into local authority children and families teams, and they do the work there. And I think they should get support and training to do that. But it's a bit like you should get to that point, like you do in teaching and in medicine, in lots of other professions, where you actually specialty train. I agree. And I think social work with disabled children is a specialty training, because I also think that when you do it and you get it right, it's one of the best jobs in the world. One of the things that working in this world that you see through Special Needs Jungle, that I see through my role, is actually this isn't a static population with a static set of issues. It's a changing world we're working in. It's a changing set of circumstances and expectations. It has to be research and evidence informed. Some of the work we've been doing recently, looking at girls with autism and how you support girls with autism who present differently, who have different needs. So it really is a sort of changing world, and that's why also you want to keep that professional development up to date.
So talking about changing worlds, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and what we've seen really is the rights of disabled children pretty much swept away. What's the CDC doing to prevent that getting worse and to try to get those easements removed?
A mix of things, really. Which reflect the sort of different roles that CDC has. So in our strategic reform partner government role, we've been working with civil servants in relation to trying to untangle some of the very confused guidance, work out what guidance people need and how it works and whatever. We've also done a lot of work on what is reasonable endeavours and trying to evidence that and understand that. Through information, advice and support programmes where we have come across illegal practice, and we have done that a number of times. We have also reported that directly into the SEN advisor team so that it can be managed. So that's our sort of business as usual stuff. How do you find good practice? How do you confront illegal practice? And how do you provide guidance that supports? Through the Special Educational Consortium and the Disabled Children's Partnership, 1, SEC we manage, 2, DCP we're part of. We have been part of the campaign to look at really pushing government on the easements in terms of evidence in it. I think when the pandemic came in, we were able to say, if you believe you need these freedoms, given this extraordinary set of circumstances, we will say fine. We will let them go and see what's happening. And then we've been watching that since. I think where we are now is really concerned that a continuation of the easements almost is giving a signal that SEN children don't matter. And so that's our worry now. We think the tide is turning from where it was. So there has got to be some real clarity now going forward about, are the easements getting in the way of school return? What else is getting in the way? And are they getting in the way of the system doing its duty?
It's assessments that's getting in the way. It's them using risk assessments as a reason to stop children coming back.
Risk assessments are a method of exclusion. Risk management are a method of inclusion. I want risk management plans in place for children going back. But my biggest single worry at the moment is if we are not careful, there will be whole groups of children that will not be back in school in the foreseeable future, and that some children won't get back. And for me, that's the biggest push. And when people say to me, you know, it's not too bad, Christine, because some children are enjoying not being in school, that worries me. Because actually those children have to have their outcomes met, and the system has to be developed to do that. I think the only thing I can say is we are engaged in this conversation every day, and we are absolutely clear that at the heart of it, the rights of children and families have to be met, and that the pandemic, as it moves on, cannot be an excuse for not doing what you do. And I think the other thing that people sometimes forget is there are local authorities that had massive problems before the pandemic hit. So actually already we had mixed practice. So what we can't have is those authorities using the pandemic as an excuse for practice that was already poor before.
And as you say, there's a lot of children who have got missed opportunities at the moment.
Yeah.
So do you think as a result, the age limit should be extended above 25 so those children don't miss those opportunities, especially in light of the fact that some local authorities are currently using COVID-19 to offer our young people to social care services who are actually not taking new referrals either. So children are being completely lost between the cracks.
To be honest, I don't know. I don't think I have enough information to know whether that's a good idea. One of the things you will know from the families that contact you is one of the real areas of challenge within the Children and Families Act implementation remains the whole area of 19 to 25. We have fundamentally not understood what an educational outcome from a 23-year-old is. You know, we are not in the best position at that level of policy. So I'm really keen that it's one of the things we look at. Whether extending the age will be helpful or not, I don't know yet, but it's worthy of consideration, as you say, because of the missed opportunities today.
And certainly keeping an eye on those children who are sort of like being pushed out into the social services when actually they really shouldn't be. Someone needs to be keeping an eye on that as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to that thing about what educational outcomes are. And it's an understanding that for lots of the children that we support and we work with and we live with, that actually they're going to take longer in reaching those outcomes than others, and they need to be supported. I suppose at the end of it, we end up with an argument about money again. But we've got
also, it goes back to individualisation as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's been over 3 years now since your review report, These Are Our Children, was published. Do you feel that the recommendations that you made in that report have been implemented and implemented successfully?
One of the things you learn about working with government and being asked to do reviews is that you're in for a long haul, and that the wind changes and things move. So I had a look back at the report again today, and what did I think? So obviously since then we have had a review of residential schools, and we've been working with residential schools, and we continue to work with residential schools to encourage them to look at more innovative ways of working, and I think they are. We have got a piece of work going on in the NHS looking at the specific needs of 18 to 25-year-olds. So it's again, Renata, going back to your point, that classic about adolescence and young adulthood, and that's being looked at. There are some workforce issues, there is some stuff. I think the thing that I'm proudest of, though it seems to be taking a long time, but it's good, is one of the things that worried me most, and when I spoke to parents, was that within the inpatient system, There were no key workers. So parents would find that their children had moved hospitals, their regime had changed, something else had happened to them, and there was no single person who was tracking progress. So we are now doing quite a big piece of work with NHS England in full co-production with parents, including many of the parents that were involved in the review, on what does good key working services look like. And money has been allocated now from the NHS England budget to make that happen. So to be honest, if I can get that through, then I will be happy. But, you know, you do that, you keep going, and then last Friday, it must have been, or last Thursday, somebody sent me the Joint Commission of Human Rights report to have a look at about the detention of disabled young people in the system. And it takes you right back to the beginning. And I think it sort of characterised for me why I do what I do. I have this absolute and utter belief that disabled children and young people are children and young people, and that throughout my career, what I've been working on is a journey towards citizenship. And that actually what we still don't have is a community and a society that supports and enables those young people to have full citizenship. And for me, that still has to be our goal. We are not there yet. And I feel like regularly that I take 3 steps forwards and at least 3 steps backwards. But that journey towards citizenship is crucial. That belief, that understanding of the equal value that those children and young people have in our society, and therefore their families do, is what keeps us going. And, you know, if I have to do another 3 reviews, and each time I take a step forward and I take a step forward, then that's what I'll do.
And in light of the current circumstances, what's Council for Disabled Children doing to help make sure that BAME families' voices are being heard at all levels as well?
Do you know, Renata, that's a really good question. And the honest answer is probably not enough, like everyone else. I went back to look at the last dedicated piece of work we did for Black and minority ethnic families, which was a good 10 years ago. And it was a piece of work funded by the Department of Health, I think, in those days, which looked at innovation and we looked at understanding. And we had about 3 or 4 years of work where we really looked at research and evidence, and we looked at inclusion and equality. And what we found was a real patchwork of provision, as we always find. I've looked at it since, and there are elements of that that go through the system, but it's a mirror that has to come back more strongly, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier about racial and economic equity, doesn't it? We know that we have we always have a range of families and a range of communities. We know in some areas it's easier to meet those needs. So in areas of the country, I was a social worker in Tower Hamlets for many years. In areas like Tower Hamlets, where there are big single groups of families from a particular background, in those days of Bangladeshi families, it was easier, not easy, but easier to develop a service in partnership in families. It was one of my jobs in those days, and I realised in a very short time, luckily, that to develop a service for white families and add Bangladeshi families on was never going to work. That I had to go back to the drawing board, I had to go and speak to the community, I had to start from the outset, and that's what we did. In communities where there is a much more mixed group of families, 40, 50 different groups, then actually where you're working there, you have to go back to basic principles, and you have to go back to principles of equity and access and workforce and all of those things. I think there is the last few weeks in terms of the murder of George Floyd and the outpourings from that are a really sober reminder to those of us who work in the system that we need to continually check that we are doing enough. And so one of the things that I've done since is I've looked at all of our programs on CDC. So what I do with our programmatic work up till now is, one of the things I say is, tell me where our evidence of participation is. Tell me at each level in every programme how we are ensuring that the voice of children, young people and families is coming through. And if it's not, why not? And go and find a way of doing it. And I think now we need the same concentrated effort within that about the needs of families from Black and minority ethnic groups, because there is no doubt they are one of the groups at the moment, in generality, that we fail most.
Yeah, absolutely. Intersectionality is so important to consider.
Absolutely.
And it's so often glossed over. I mean, I recently went and did big search as well for information and was struggling to find anything.
Yeah.
It's quite shocking how little there is.
It is. And again, it depends on who's advocating, doesn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, for your very informative answers.
Yes,
we really appreciate your time. And hopefully we've answered as many questions as we possibly can. And everyone's happy, with the results that we've got for them. To everyone out there who's listening, thank you for joining us. If there's anyone else you'd like us to talk to, do let us know.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Good to talk to you both.